Jake Morrison had been flying cargo runs between frontier colonies for 6 years, and in all that time he'd never found a stowaway bleeding in his cargo bay while making the kind of desperate sounds that suggested someone was running for their life. The alien girl couldn't have been more than 20 by human standards, with the characteristic pale purple skin and delicate pointed ears that marked her as Valdris, one of the more reclusive species in this sector. She was curled behind a stack of supply crates, clutching what appeared to be a severe plasma burn on her left arm while her large, silver eyes tracked Jake's movement with the kind of alert terror that came from recent trauma. "Hey," Jake said softly, raising his hands to show he wasn't armed, "it's okay. You're safe now." The girl said something in rapid Valdris that his universal translator couldn't quite parse, though the desperate tone suggested she was either asking for help or apologizing for the intrusion. Blood loss and shock had left her shaking, but she managed to point toward the cargo bay doors while making urgent gestures that clearly meant, "We need to leave, now." Jake activated his ship's external scanners, and what he saw made his stomach drop. 3 hunter vessels were approaching his position with the kind of aggressive formation that meant they were tracking something valuable and weren't particularly concerned about legal niceties like territorial sovereignty or cargo vessel protection protocols. "Shit," Jake muttered, then looked at the injured Valdris girl who was watching him with desperate hope. "Okay, sweetheart, looks like we're both in trouble now." He sealed the cargo bay and headed for the cockpit, noting how the girl struggled to follow him despite her obvious injuries. She settled into the co-pilot seat with obvious relief, though she continued scanning the ship's interior like she expected threats to materialize from the bulkheads. "Jake Morrison," he said, pointing to himself while initiating emergency departure procedures. "Human. Cargo pilot. Currently upgrading to refugee transport, apparently." "Lyra," the girl replied, managing a weak smile despite her obvious pain. She pointed to herself, then to Jake, then made a series of gestures that his translator rendered as something like, "grateful beyond words." The next 20 minutes were the most intense flying Jake had done since his military service, evading hunter ships through an asteroid field while his injured passenger held on with the kind of stoic determination that suggested she was accustomed to surviving impossible situations. By the time they reached safe hyperspace, Lyra had passed out from blood loss and Jake had committed himself to a course of action that was either humanitarian heroism or spectacularly poor judgment, depending on your perspective. He spent the 12-hour journey to Nexus Station treating Lyra's injuries with his ship's basic medical supplies while she drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring what sounded like prayers or promises in her musical native language. When Lyra finally woke up properly, they were docked at Nexus Station and Jake was arranging for proper medical care and diplomatic assistance to get her back to her people. "Better?" Jake asked, noting how Lyra's color had improved and her eyes were tracking normally. Instead of answering, Lyra stood up and moved toward Jake with fluid grace, reaching out to touch his hands while speaking in rapid Valdris that carried harmonics he'd never heard before, something that sounded formal and deeply significant. "Whoa," Jake said, gently extracting his hands from her surprisingly strong grip. "I think you're still a little confused. You're safe now. We're getting you help." Lyra's expression shifted to something that looked like confusion mixed with alarm. She pointed to herself, then to Jake, then made an elaborate gesture that encompassed both of them while speaking with obvious urgency. 20 minutes later, Jake found himself in Nexus Station's diplomatic center with Lyra, a Valdris cultural liaison named Dr. Velthani, and a growing sense that his simple rescue mission had become significantly more complicated than intended. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Velthani said after a lengthy conversation with Lyra in their native language, "I need to explain something important about Valdris culture that may affect your current situation." "What kind of something?" Jake asked, though Lyra's behavior was already suggesting answers he probably didn't want to hear. "According to Lyra, you saved her life when she was certain she would die. This creates what we call kathera, a life bond that establishes permanent spiritual connection between the saved and the savior." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Permanent? Lyra now considers herself your HFY, your life-bound guardian. More importantly, she considers you her Vel Keth, her protector and spiritual anchor." These bonds cannot be broken by distance, time, or formal dissolution. Dr. Velthani, Jake said carefully, I was just helping someone who needed help. I didn't sign up for any kind of permanent arrangement. Dr. Velthani translated this for Lyra, whose response was immediate and emphatic, accompanied by gestures that made her meaning clear even without translation. Lyra says, Dr. Velthani continued with obvious discomfort, that choice was removed from both of you the moment you decided her life was worth saving. She now belongs to you, and you belong to her, according to laws that predate Valdris civilization. Jake looked at Lyra, who was watching him with an expression that mixed adoration with something that looked uncomfortably like possessive determination. And if I explain that humans don't have these kinds of permanent spiritual bonds? Jake asked. Lyra says that human customs are irrelevant to Valdris' spiritual reality, Dr. Velthani replied diplomatically. She says the bond exists whether you acknowledge it or not. As Jake processed the fact that his act of basic human decency had apparently resulted in acquiring an alien girl who believed she now owned him permanently, he couldn't help but think that the universe had a seriously twisted sense of humor. The look in Lyra's silver eyes suggested she was planning to follow him anywhere he went, for the rest of both their lives. Dr. Velthani, Jake said with growing desperation, please tell me there's some kind of cultural loophole that gets me out of this situation. Dar. Velthani's expression suggested that Jake had just asked for something equivalent to reversing gravity through positive thinking. Mr. Morrison, she said gently, I'm afraid that from Lyra's perspective, you belong to her now. And she has no intention of letting you go. Jake's first full day with an alien girl who believed she permanently owned him was educational in ways that no xenocultural training course had ever prepared him for. Lyra followed him everywhere with the devoted attention of someone guarding precious cargo, positioning herself between Jake and every person who approached him, and demonstrating what Dr. Sarah Chen would later describe as the most intense case of protective attachment in recorded interspecies psychology. She's been sitting outside your quarters for 6 hours, Dr. Chen observed, settling beside Jake in the station's cafeteria while Lyra maintained her vigilant position exactly 3 meters away, close enough to intervene if anyone threatened Jake but far enough to avoid intruding on his meal. I told her she could use the guest quarters, Jake replied, cutting his breakfast into smaller pieces to make it last longer and delay the inevitable return to his rooms where Lyra would resume her devoted surveillance. She said something that Dr. Velthani translated as, guardians don't abandon their sacred responsibility for comfort. Sacred responsibility, Dr. Chen repeated, making notes on her data pad with the enthusiasm of someone documenting unprecedented xenopsychological phenomena. Jake, do you understand what you've accidentally stumbled into? I understand that I rescued someone and now she thinks we're spiritually married or something equally insane. Not married, Dr. Chen corrected, consulting her rapidly expanding collection of Valdris cultural documentation. According to my research, the life bond Lyra claims is more like permanent mutual guardianship. She's committed to protecting you from any threat, and she expects you to provide her with security and purpose in return. Jake looked across the cafeteria to where Lyra was politely but firmly discouraging a Rigelian merchant from approaching their table, her delicate appearance contrasting with the unmistakable authority in her posture. Dr. Chen, she's half my size and just recovered from serious injuries. What exactly is she protecting me from? Everything, Dr. Chen replied matter-of-factly. Jake, Valdris' protective instincts are legendary. When they bond with someone, they become capable of violence that would surprise species twice their size. As if to demonstrate this point, Lyra moved with fluid precision to intercept a station security officer who was walking in Jake's general direction, engaging in what appeared to be polite conversation while positioning herself to respond to any perceived threat. She's not even armed, Jake observed. She doesn't need to be armed, Dr. Chen said, showing Jake video footage from earlier that morning. Watch this. The recording showed Lyra in the station's common area, demonstrating to curious onlookers her species' natural abilities. What Jake saw made him understand why Valdris were considered one of the more formidable species despite their seemingly fragile appearance. Lyra moved with speed and precision that made human martial arts look clumsy by comparison. Valdris physiology is optimized for protection and survival, Dr. Chen explained. Enhanced reflexes, natural toxin resistance, and the ability to enter combat states that increase their strength exponentially. Lyra may look delicate, but she's probably the most dangerous person on this station when motivated to protect someone she's bonded with. And she's motivated to protect me. She's motivated to die for you if necessary, Dr. Chen corrected. Jake, the life bond isn't just cultural, it's physiological. Valdris who form these connections experience actual withdrawal symptoms if separated from their bonded partner. Before Jake could process the implications of that statement, Lyra approached their table with the fluid grace that marked her species, carrying what appeared to be a carefully prepared meal that she set in front of Jake with obvious satisfaction. Kethvel, she said, which Dr. Chen's translator rendered as something like, nourishment for my protected one. Lyra, Jake said gently, I can get my own food. You don't need to take care of me. Lyra's response was immediate and emphatic, delivered in rapid Valdris that made her meaning clear even without translation. Taking care of Jake wasn't optional service, it was fundamental responsibility. She says, Dr. Chen translated, that providing for your welfare is not a burden but a privilege. And that questioning her role as your guardian causes her emotional distress. Jake studied Lyra's face, noting how her silver eyes showed something that looked like anxiety mixed with confusion at his apparent rejection of her care. Dar. Chen, he said quietly, how exactly do I explain to someone that I don't want to be protected and provided for by someone I barely know? Very carefully, Dr. Chen replied. Because from Lyra's perspective, you've already accepted her guardianship by allowing her to live. Rejecting her care now would be like rejecting her existence. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of 3 Valdris in formal diplomatic attire, led by an imposing male whose bearing suggested high rank and serious displeasure. Lyra's reaction was immediate. She moved to place herself between Jake and the newcomers while speaking in formal tones that carried undertones of challenge. Mr. Morrison, the lead Valdris said in accented standard, I am Veltar, clan leader and father to the young woman who has apparently claimed you as her life bond. We need to discuss this situation. Jake stood, noting how Lyra shifted position to maintain her protective stance while addressing her father with obvious respect mixed with unmistakable determination. Clan leader Veltar, Jake replied, I think there's been a misunderstanding about what happened between Lyra and me. Has there? Veltar's silver eyes fixed on Jake with calculating intensity. My daughter was missing for 6 days, presumed dead at the hands of illegal hunters. She returns claiming life bond with a human cargo pilot and refusing to discuss her return to our homeworld. I found her injured in my cargo bay and got her to safety, Jake explained. I was planning to arrange her return to your people once she recovered. And yet she refuses to leave your side, Veltar observed. Lyra tells me that separation from you would violate sacred obligations that supersede family loyalty. Lyra spoke again in rapid Valdris, her tone carrying the kind of passionate conviction that needed no translation. Her father's response was equally emphatic, and Jake found himself watching what appeared to be a family argument conducted in a language of musical undertones and complex harmonics. What are they discussing? Jake asked Dr. Chen. Lyra is explaining that the life bond cannot be dissolved by family pressure or cultural convenience, Dr. Chen translated. Her father is arguing that humans cannot understand or honor Valdris' spiritual obligations. And what does Lyra say to that? She says that your actions demonstrate understanding of Valdris values better than most of her own people, and that spiritual bonds transcend species boundaries when formed through genuine sacrifice. Veltar turned his attention back to Jake, his expression showing complex emotions that suggested this conversation was as difficult for him as it was unexpected. Mr. Morrison, he said formally, my daughter believes you saved her life at risk to your own safety. Is this accurate? I helped someone who needed help, Jake replied. I didn't think about risk or spiritual obligations. That, Veltar said quietly, is exactly what makes your actions spiritually significant according to our beliefs. As Jake processed the fact that his simple human decency had accidentally triggered alien religious protocols, he realized that his situation was more complex than cultural misunderstanding. Lyra genuinely believed that saving her life had created sacred obligations that she was prepared to honor for the rest of both their lives, regardless of his feelings about the arrangement. The confrontation Jake had been dreading reached its crisis point when clan leader Veltar demanded that Lyra return to the Valdres homeworld for proper evaluation of her psychological condition, suggesting that her attachment to Jake was trauma-induced rather than spiritually authentic. "Father," Lyra said in heavily accented standard, switching languages so Jake could understand her response, "you cannot command the dissolution of sacred bonds because they inconvenience your political plans. I can command my daughter to return home for healing from whatever psychological manipulation she has experienced," Veltar replied sharply, his silver eyes focusing on Jake with obvious suspicion. "This human has somehow convinced you to abandon your people and your responsibilities." Jake felt every eye in the diplomatic center focus on him as the conversation moved from family disagreement into accusations of cultural manipulation. Lyra's reaction was immediate and protective. She positioned herself directly between Jake and her father while speaking in tones that carried unmistakable challenge. "Lyra's defending you," Dr. Chen whispered, studying her translator readings with obvious concern. "She's telling her father that any attempt to separate you will be met with resistance." "Resistance?" Jake asked, though Lyra's posture suggested she was prepared for conflict with her own family. "The kind of resistance that turns diplomatic incidents into interspecies conflicts," Dr. Chen replied grimly. "Jake, Valdres take life bonds seriously enough to fight wars over them." Before Jake could process the implications of that statement, station security arrived with the kind of coordinated response that suggested someone had called for backup. The diplomatic center was suddenly full of armed personnel trying to manage a situation that none of them understood but all of them recognized as potentially explosive. "Mr. Morrison," said Commander Torres, the station security chief, "we need to resolve this situation before it escalates beyond our ability to contain it." "Commander," Jake replied, "I'm not sure how to resolve something I don't understand and didn't ask for." "You could start," Veltar interjected, "by explaining how you convinced my daughter to violate centuries of Valdres cultural tradition for the sake of attachment to a species she'd never encountered before." "I didn't convince her of anything," Jake protested. "I found her bleeding in my cargo bay and got her to medical care. Everything else has been her interpretation of what that means." Lyra spoke again in rapid Valdres, her tone carrying desperate urgency that made her father's expression shift from anger to something that looked like genuine concern. "What is she saying?" Jake asked Dr. Chen. "She's explaining what happened before you found her," Dr. Chen translated with growing alarm. "Jake, the hunters didn't just capture Lyra, they killed her traveling companions, including her betrothed and her brother. She was the only survivor." The diplomatic center fell silent as everyone processed the implications of what Lyra had revealed. Jake felt something cold settle in his chest as he began to understand that Lyra's attachment to him wasn't just cultural tradition, it was desperate clinging to the only person who had shown her kindness after experiencing devastating loss. "Lyra," Jake said gently, "I'm sorry about your family. But attaching yourself to me isn't going to bring them back." Lyra's response was immediate and heartbreaking, tears gathering in her silver eyes while she spoke in tones that carried profound grief mixed with desperate determination. "She says," Dr. Chen translated with obvious emotion, "that she knows her family is gone forever. But you prove that not all beings in the galaxy are hunters or victims. You gave her hope that protection and kindness still exist. And she's afraid," Veltar added quietly, his anger replaced by paternal concern, "that if she lets you go, she'll lose the only source of security she's found since the attack." Jake looked at Lyra, noting how her delicate hands were trembling with the effort of controlling emotions that were clearly overwhelming her ability to process them rationally. "Lyra," he said, moving closer despite the security personnel who were clearly prepared to intervene if the situation escalated, "you don't own me, and I don't own you. People can care about each other without permanent spiritual bonds." Lyra's response was a flood of vulgarity that made her father wince and Dr. Chen's translator struggle to keep up with the complex emotional content. She says that caring without commitment is what allowed the hunters to destroy her family, Dr. Chen translated. That temporary protection is no protection at all when people can choose to abandon their responsibilities. I'm not abandoning you, Jake said, taking Lyra's hands despite the obvious risk of encouraging her attachment. But I can't be your permanent security blanket. You need to heal from what happened to you, not transfer your need for safety onto someone you barely know. What happened next was something Dr. Chen would later describe as the most dramatic physiological response to emotional trauma I've ever witnessed in interspecies psychology. Lyra collapsed. Not gradually, not with warning symptoms, but instantly and completely, as if Jake's words had severed some vital connection that kept her conscious. Her breathing became shallow, her skin shifted to pale gray tones that suggested serious physiological distress, and her vital signs on Dr. Chen's scanner dropped to levels that indicated potential organ failure. Medical emergency, Commander Torres called into his comm unit. We need xenobiological specialists immediately. What's happening to her? Jake demanded, kneeling beside Lyra's unconscious form while medical personnel rushed into the diplomatic center. Withdrawal, Dr. Chen said grimly, studying her readings with obvious alarm. Jake, I think the life bond isn't just psychological, there's actual biochemical dependency involved. Veltar knelt on Lyra's other side, his expression showing parental terror mixed with something that looked like guilt. She hasn't formed proper life bonds since the attack, he said quietly. Her psychological trauma has been affecting her ability to maintain normal social connections. And now? Jake asked, watching Lyra's breathing become increasingly labored. Now she's experiencing separation trauma from someone she's imprinted on as her primary source of security, Dr. Chen replied. Jake, if she can't stabilize her connection with you, this could kill her. As medical personnel worked to stabilize Lyra's condition, Jake realized that his simple rescue mission had evolved into something far more complex than cultural misunderstanding. Lyra wasn't just claiming ownership of him, she was desperately clinging to the only person who had made her feel safe since her world was destroyed by violence. And rejecting that attachment might literally destroy her. Lyra's recovery took 3 days in the station's medical bay, during which Jake found himself maintaining constant vigil while xenobiological specialists worked to understand the physiological crisis that his rejection had triggered. What they discovered revolutionized understanding of Valdra's psychology and forced Jake to confront the complexity of his situation. The life bond isn't just cultural tradition, Dr. Elena Vasquez, the station's leading xenobiologist, explained to the assembled group that now included Jake, Veltar, Dr. Chen, and several diplomatic observers. Valdras who experience severe trauma can develop neurochemical dependencies on individuals who represent safety and security. Jake studied Lyra's sleeping form, noting how her color had returned to normal purple tones but her vital signs still showed stress patterns whenever he moved too far from her bedside. Are you saying she's physically addicted to my presence? He asked. I'm saying that your rescue created a psychological anchor that her traumatized nervous system is using to regulate stress hormones and maintain basic physiological stability, Dr. Vasquez replied. Separating her from you triggers withdrawal symptoms that can be fatal. Veltar sat heavily in a chair beside his daughter's bed, his expression showing the weight of parental guilt and cultural confusion. Dr. Vasquez, is this condition permanent? That depends on whether Lyra can develop healthy coping mechanisms that don't require constant proximity to Mr. Morrison, Dr. Vasquez said. But forcing separation before she's psychologically ready could cause irreversible neurological damage. Jake felt the weight of unwanted responsibility settle on his shoulders like lead plating. So I'm stuck with her. You're both stuck with each other until we can find a way to help Lyra heal from her trauma while maintaining the security connection she needs to survive, Dr. Chen corrected diplomatically. Before anyone could respond to that analysis, Lyra stirred in her medical bed, her silver eyes opening to immediately locate Jake among the assembled group. Her relief at seeing him was obvious and heartbreaking, followed by distress when she noticed the serious expressions on everyone's faces. "Jake," she said in carefully practiced standard, her voice carrying fear that she'd done something wrong. "I'm here," Jake replied, moving closer to her bedside and noting how his proximity immediately improved her vital signs. "How are you feeling?" "Afraid," Lyra admitted, switching to Valdris and speaking through Dr. Chen's translator. "Afraid that you will decide I am too much trouble and leave me alone." Jake looked around the medical bay at the people whose job it was to solve diplomatic and medical crises, all of whom were clearly hoping he would provide some solution to a situation that had no easy answers. "Lyra," he said carefully, "I'm not going to abandon you. But we need to figure out how to help you feel safe without making me feel trapped." Lyra's response was immediate and emphatic, delivered in tones that suggested she was making some kind of important decision. "She says," Dr. Chen translated, "that she understands her attachment is unhealthy and frightening to you. She wants to learn how to be your guardian without being your burden." "Guardian?" Jake repeated. "Protector, partner, support system," Dr. Chen clarified. "Lyra is offering to modify the life bond from possessive ownership to cooperative partnership." Veltar leaned forward with obvious interest. "Lyra, are you saying you're willing to adapt Valdris traditions to accommodate human customs?" Lyra nodded, then spoke directly to Jake in halting standard. "I learn your ways. I protect, but not possess. You teach me human friendship." Jake felt something shift in his chest as he realized that Lyra was offering to change fundamental aspects of her cultural programming for the sake of their relationship. Not because she wanted to, but because she recognized that her current approach was unsustainable. "Lyra," he said, taking her hand and noting how the contact immediately calmed her stress indicators, "what if we started over? Not as life-bound guardian and protected one, but as people who went through something traumatic together and want to help each other heal." "Like partners?" Lyra asked hopefully. "Like friends who look out for each other," Jake confirmed. "You can travel with me, learn about human culture, and I'll help you feel safe while you recover from what happened to your family." Dr. Vasquez made notes on her medical scanner with obvious satisfaction. That approach could work. Gradual transition from dependent attachment to cooperative partnership, maintaining the security connection while building healthy independence. Veltar studied both Jake and his daughter with complex emotions that suggested he was reassessing his initial disapproval. "Mr. Morrison, are you offering to take responsibility for my daughter's welfare while she heals?" "I'm offering to be her friend and partner," Jake corrected. "Someone she can count on without owning or being owned by." Lyra's response was a flood of Valdris that made her father smile for the first time since arriving at the station. "She says," Veltar translated, "that friendship based on choice is more valuable than bonds based on obligation. And that learning to trust without possessing will make her stronger than traditional life bonds ever could." The arrangement they worked out over the following week was unprecedented in Valdris cultural history. A modified life bond that honored Lyra's need for security while respecting Jake's autonomy. Lyra would travel with Jake as his co-pilot and partner, learning human customs while providing the protection and loyalty that her people were known for. "So," Dr. Chen said during their final consultation before departure, "you're essentially taking on an alien intern who's programmed to die for you but is learning to express that through healthy partnership instead of possessive attachment." "When you put it that way, it sounds completely insane," Jake observed. "It sounds like the foundation for an extraordinary partnership," Lyra corrected in improving standard, her skin patterns showing the warm purple tones that indicated contentment and hope. "Jake teaches me independence. I teach him Valdris protection skills. We both learn that belonging to someone can mean choosing them every day instead of claiming them forever." 6 months later, their cargo hauling partnership had become legendary among frontier colonies for efficiency, reliability, and a kind of coordinated teamwork that made other crews envious. Lyra had learned to channel her protective instincts into tactical support and navigation assistance, while Jake had discovered that having someone completely committed to his welfare was less suffocating and more comforting than he'd expected. "Still think I belong to you?" Jake asked during a quiet moment between cargo runs, watching Lyra practice human meditation techniques that Dr. Vasquez had recommended for managing anxiety. Yes, Lyra replied with a smile that showed how much her understanding of belonging had evolved, but now I know that belonging is something we choose together, not something one person claims from another. She moved closer, her natural grace making the ship's cramped quarters seem spacious. Jake, do you know what I learned about human customs? What's that? That the strongest bonds are the ones people enter freely and maintain through daily choice rather than permanent obligation, Lyra said, taking his hand with the gentle confidence that had replaced her desperate clinging. I belong to you because I choose to, every day. And you belong to me because you choose to stay, even when staying is difficult. As Jake looked at the alien woman who had transformed from traumatized refugee to trusted partner, he realized that sometimes the most rewarding relationships were the ones that began with unwanted responsibility but evolved into genuine love through patience, understanding, and the courage to grow together. Lyra had taught him that belonging to someone didn't mean losing yourself, it meant finding someone worth choosing again and again, no matter how complicated the circumstances that brought you together. And Jake had taught her that true security came not from possessing someone, but from trusting that they would choose to stay because they valued what you built together. They made an extraordinary team, proving that sometimes the most unexpected partnerships create the strongest bonds when nurtured by people willing to adapt their understanding of love to honor both individual freedom and mutual commitment.